Welcome to the Principles of Performance podcast, where we discuss how to optimize your health, fitness, and performance. Drawing on decades of experience of working as coaches, consultants, and trainers to top performers, athletes, and teams from professional sports to top universities to the U.S. military, Eric DeGatti and Mike Perry discuss topics and strategies of how to perform at your highest level and be your very best. Join us and our friends and colleagues who are leaders in the fitness and performance industry as we investigate and challenge the most popular training, nutrition, lifestyle, and recovery protocols. And away we go. Here we are with episode number 26 of the Principles of Performance podcast. I am your host, Eric DeGatti, along with my friend and co-host, Mike Perry. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm well. I got a Michael this morning. Usually when I get a Michael, I feel like I'm in trouble, but I'm doing well, Eric. How are you? How are you today, bud?
That's just to keep you in line for the rest of the interview.
That's
all right. Doing great. We lucked out. Another great guest that we have here. We have Dr. Jeremy Loenneke. I came across Dr. Loenneke's work when he was a guest on Peter Attia's podcast. And he's got some pretty amazing credentials. They include a master's degree in nutrition and exercise science from Southeast Missouri State University, as well as a PhD in exercise physiology from University of Oklahoma. He's now the director of the Kevser Ermin Applied Physiology Laboratory. He's down at Ole Miss University, and his research group's primary focus is on skeletal muscle adaptations to exercise with and without the application of blood flow restriction training, or BFR, and that's what we're going to be talking a whole bunch about today. He's a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine and a member of the American Physiological Society. He's also authored numerous peer-reviewed articles and currently serves as the editorial board for Sports Medicine, Medicines and Science in Sports and Exercise, PLOS One, Peer J, and the Journal of Trainology. Jeremy, welcome to the Principles of Performance.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's good to see you guys.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on. So let's go right into this whole BFR thing and talk about blood flow restriction training. And can we start with just what a basic definition of what that even is for the listeners who aren't familiar?
Yeah, essentially, we're placing a cuff at the top of the limb. So in this case, it's the top of the arm or the top of the leg. And you're inflating it to a pressure that restricts blood flow, but doesn't completely cut it off. So blood flow is going into the limb. There's just not a lot of blood flow going out of the limb. And when this is combined with kind of low force contractions, so low intensity exercise, low loads, we typically see some beneficial adaptations to the muscle.
Now, how did you get originally introduced to BFR? Because you've done a lot of work with it. So how did you come across it and get introduced to it?
Yeah, the first time was probably around 2007. I was an undergrad. I was, just getting ready to finish up, looking for internships. And I was kind of really interested in trying to get into doing research. So I was reading the scientific literature. And the first time I came across it, I read about it, but I just kind of assumed that I just didn't have any idea what I was reading because, you read it, it's like, oh, they restricted blood flow, something good happened. I'm like, I just must not understand what I'm reading. So I went to Illinois for my internship, and up there in one of the gyms, I came across Lane Norton, Gabe Wilson, some of those guys, and they were also talking about blood flow restriction. So I was like, well, maybe I was reading that correctly. So then I just started kind of going through the literature and reading more and more and more about it. And then ultimately started doing research on it in 2008. But that's kind of how it started, reading about it, but kind of not sure if I was reading it correctly. And then kind of getting really fascinated with it.
Sounds like us reading most research, Mike. But so a little bit of history, if you can give us a little bit of history on BFR and like who was this originally intended for, and who kind of was the benefactor of the initial work with this?
Yeah, I think the legend has it, and it is very much a legend. Sato is probably the guy from Japan who made it the most popular. He's got quite a story about how he came across using it for his own rehabilitation. and did a lot of trial and error, regardless of how much of the story is true or false. I think it's fair to say that he did make it kind of popular. He popularized his own device, which is the Katsu Master. That was kind of one of the original devices. I'd say the first time it ever showed up in the literature for how we use it, and I try to add these caveats because once I start saying Shinohara was one of the first papers that used blood flow restriction, you'll have people who will come and say, well, what about these other studies that apply to cuff during exercise? But they were doing it, for other mechanistic purposes, for the purposes of increasing muscle size and strength with low loads and low intensities. The first published paper was Shinohara in 1998, as far as I know. So it's hard to say who it was, who it was designed for. I think Sato, if you believe some of what he says, he was kind of interested in bodybuilding, was kind of looking at different ways to do things. But I think whatever the reasons are, I think it became pretty clear that this might be a pretty important tool for rehabilitation. Not to say that other people can't use it, not to say that it couldn't be useful for just everyday individuals, but I think it's pretty clear that if it can do some of these things that we say it does, then that's got a big upside in the rehabilitation side.
Very cool. So while we're on the topic of rehab, are there any certain types of injuries or pathologies that seem to respond really, really well to BFR?
Yeah, I'll answer this very surface level. I try to be very transparent that I'm not a clinician, and as I said earlier, I don't play one on the internet either. I think the way that I always try to represent this when I'm talking to people who are clinicians is I try and just say, look, I study normal, healthy individuals, how to best apply it, how we think it might be working, what are some methodologies behind it, and then they can use that however they see fit with their clinical expertise. I will say that there is some literature with post-ACL surgery where it seems like it might have some benefit there, where maybe you can't load very heavy. There's some, patellar pain patients that there might be some utility there, maybe some Achilles injuries. So it's been used in a lot of different areas, but I think it's going to come down to what that clinician kind of thinks for their patient and how best they can utilize it.
So is one of the big takeaways that we can get more work done with a greater efficiency, like create a greater physiological load without that? And I dare say that orthopedic cost. And I say that because I know Coach Mike Boyle posted something about this that got a lot of backfire from some of the pain science people. But basically, can we get more work done without putting stress or risk at the joints?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think you can certainly say it without having to load like you normally would. You can get similar aspects depending on what we're talking about. I think with muscle adaptation, so muscle growth, some of the vascular changes, I think you're going to see a lot with blood flow restriction with low loads. You'll also get a little bit stronger, but not to the same extent as high load exercise, but you will get stronger. I think one of the things that's kind of starting to come out in the past couple of years is there could also be some changes at the tendon level. I think for a long time it was thought that, hey, maybe you actually maybe that's one of the things that blood flow nutrition doesn't do very well. Maybe you need quite a bit of load to augment the tendon. Some recent data suggests that maybe that's not the case. I would say that there's not a lot of work done on that, so we need a lot more. But I think that it might have some benefit there as well. But yeah, certainly you're getting a big bang without a high load. I think that's fair to say.
So now let's flip it the other way. So what are some of the potential risks of BFR? So I was even just talking with one of my clients because he saw a Lane Norton post that he just recently had about blood flow restriction. He's like, seems kind of dangerous, like cutting off blood flow to areas. So are there any specific risks, or are there specific populations that there's contraindications where you wouldn't want to use BFR with them?
Yeah, I think with respect to safety, the way that I like to think about it is because that was kind of my first thought too. I think it's most people's first thought when you first hear it. It's like, wait a second, what are we talking about? You're restricting blood flow. I thought blood flow was good. So I think the way to think about it is, you know, when we apply blood flow restriction, it's a very acute stimulus. So we're applying it for minutes, and we're not cutting off blood flow completely, right? So we're restricting blood flow partially for minutes, not for hours. Certainly, if we were to apply blood flow restriction for days, it's hard for me to imagine that there wouldn't be something bad that would happen. So I think we have to start with that. It's a very acute stimulus. It's partial restriction, so blood flow is going into the limb. But I think to your point, we have to think about the safety aspects. So I think two of the concerns that people typically have are related to blood clots and related to muscle damage. So I think the way to think about this is not, does it have risk? It certainly does. Exercise itself has risk. But I think the point is how much does it increase your risk? So when we look at normal, healthy individuals, or even some of the clinical populations, it doesn't appear to increase your risk for either one of those things. That doesn't mean that there's not some population out there that would do this and wouldn't have something happen. You know, it's very possible, but I think when we look at the literature, it doesn't seem like it's increasing your risk that much. There's still a risk, but I think we have to think about how we're applying that, and how long we're applying it, and what the pressure is. And but certainly, I think, what populations would you want to be kind of cautious with? I would say, do you have some sort of condition where you have an elevated risk for blood clot? That's not to say that you couldn't use blood flow restriction, but maybe you need to be a little bit more vigilant. Do you have the sickle cell trait? You know, there's no literature that suggests that you couldn't do that safely that I'm aware of, but maybe you're a little bit cautious. You know, so I think if you have some sort of risk related to that, or if you have kind of a condition where maybe you're going to have maybe your cardiovascular response responds a little bit strong to like a metabolic buildup. You know, there was some suggestion. Marty Springer wrote a paper about that, where, you know, there are some people who are very sensitive to that, and their blood pressure response changes much more rapidly than a normal individual. So again, not to say that you couldn't use it, but those are populations where maybe you want to be working with somebody who really knows what they're doing, who can monitor it, so you can know whether or not it's going to be a concern. But I think for most people, I think it's going to have a very similar safety profile as regular exercise.
Awesome. And just to clarify, since Mike works with a lot of MMA fighters and pro fighters, when he means blood flow restriction, he doesn't mean a chokehold, Mike. Like when you turn blue, that's definitely a risk factor.
Yeah, well, that's we want to cut off all blood flow in MMA when we're trying to choke someone out. So it's a little different for sure. So we don't want to leave anything moving there. But yeah, so that you're right. That's the good thing you put that in there, Eric, for sure.
Absolutely. So now the bigger risk factor, I would think, would be in the hands of the practitioner, right? And so you don't want just anybody buying a set of cuffs off the internet and then starting to apply it to you know, athletes and clients and so forth. So what are some of those considerations in terms of like what qualifications, or what are some of the things you would want to have someone be able to have in their toolkit before they go out and start practicing BFR?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one, because I think it really depends on who you are and who you're working with. So if you're just interested in applying it to yourself and you don't have any big risk factors, you know, I think my recommendation for you would be completely different than if you're someone who's applying it to a client. To me, and maybe you disagree, but to me, those are two different situations. I think if you are working with a client, or you're working with someone where you're trying to apply to someone else, I think you should, you know, there's quite a different, there's programs out there where you can get certified. You know, it's not to say that you couldn't use blood flow restriction without that. But I think, you know, some of the things you have to keep in mind when you're applying the stimulus is, what pressure am I applying? How important is it that I know the pressure? if you're working with a clinical population, it's probably pretty important. If you're just a everyday person who is just trying to kind of experiment and try to keep training kind of interesting, it's still important, but probably not as important as someone who's dealing with an injury. But what pressure should it be? What size of the cuff are we using? Are we even using a cuff, or are we using some sort of practical wrap? If you're using that, then you have it's much more practical. To be able to apply it is easier, but to know what pressure you're applying becomes much more difficult. So I've totally kind of boggled my response to this, but I think it depends upon who you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with a client, what cuff size am I using? What pressure am I going to be applying to that? How do I make it relative? And how do I know those things? Well, you have different cuffs or different people who have these businesses that have certifications. I don't know how good any of them are. I'm sure they're fine. I know Johnny Owens, he has kind of his certification. I know Johnny, I think he's a good guy. I know there's a couple other, the blood flow restriction pro guys. I think they're pretty good. Is it a requirement? I just think it depends upon how you're using it and who you're applying it to. So maybe you can help me ask a little bit better questions, because I just kind of screwed all that up.
No, not at all. And I guess just the concern is that someone hears this or sees a post on social media, and then they run out and they're starting to strap this to their clients without having the skill set to know when, where, and why, and what they're looking for. And like you said, if they're not having gauges, and now they're doing anything from using cuffs or just going out and buying, voodoo straps and starting to cut stuff off without knowing, okay, well, here's when, where, how, why, and how much. So I think that's important.
Yeah. And I think if I was going to apply it to someone else, and it was a business of mine, I think I'd want to know what pressure I'm applying. There's a variety of ways that you can do that. There are cuffs that can tell you the pressure that you're applying. You might be able to use kind of a Doppler probe or some other way to estimate the pressure. But at least you have some idea of what pressure you're applying. I think the key point, though, is a lot of it's going to depend on what size of the cuff that you're using. If it's a wider cuff, so one that is more traditional with blood pressure, the pressure is going to have to be lower at all pressures, because it takes less pressure to cut off blood flow with a wide cuff. If it's a narrow cuff, then the pressure is going to be higher, just in general, because it's going to take a higher pressure to restrict blood flow. If you set a pressure that's relative to the cuff, in other words, if you have a Doppler probe, like a handheld probe that can detect a pulse, or you have something that can detect a pulse, all you have to do is take whatever cuff that you're going to use and just slowly inflate the pressure until you get to the point where there is no flow, so you don't hear a pulse. And then that's the arterial occlusion pressure. You can take a percentage of that. So in our case, let's say because math is not my strong point, let's just say we inflate it up to 100 millimeters of mercury, and we don't have any flow whatsoever. That's the lowest pressure where there is no flow, so there's no pulse. We would just take 40% of that, or 80%, whatever. And then you apply that, and that you always have arterial inflow going into the muscle, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So, I think, what we're saying here is, listen, if you are going to get interested in blood flow training, spend some time using it on yourself, get acclimated to it, have that hands-on experience. Don't just buy it and start throwing it on the arms of your patients and clients. Like, have a little bit of skin in the game at first. And it's kind of the same thing when we design programs, we talk about program design in our course. It's like, listen, you can't just start throwing in all of these, random sort of things into your program and expect it to go well, especially if you haven't done it. Like, I hear people saying, oh, I do a Tabata, this and that. And I'm like, do you even know what that is, first of all? And then at the same time, do you know how hard that is and what that actually feels like? Because you wouldn't be prescribing these things if you actually knew how it feels. So I think a big part of it is just getting that hands-on experience. But, you started to mention a few different names and some people that, have courses. Are there any brands of blood flow restriction equipment that you recommend or that you found to be the most user-friendly or reliable? And if you can't mention, names because of, for whatever reasons, we totally get it. But are there certain key things to look at when it comes to purchasing a BFR unit?
Yeah, I've used a few different types, and I've had people send me some things. I think some of them are getting pretty good, with being able to detect the pressure, and then that does all the things that I just talked about on its own. So I don't, there are companies that have stuff like that. I don't necessarily know all of them by name, but yeah, I think, especially if you're dealing with clients, if I'm buying a cuff, is it going to be able to tell me what pressure I need to apply? Some of them have that built into the actual cuff, so that's pretty cool. There's some other ones that kind of play on the idea of practical blood flow restriction. That's something that we dabble in. We've been dabbling in for probably a decade now, is for those people who don't have the money for expensive equipment. But that has major limitations. But there are some of those devices where they build it into the clothing itself, which is kind of cool. But for me, I would say if I was going to purchase it to apply it to someone else, I'd want to have a cuff system that was able to tell me what pressure I'm actually applying. That way, I can try and apply it in the safest way possible. So for me, in the upper body, I kind of like a more narrow cuff. The issue with using a narrow cuff in the lower body is that you're never going to be able to really know what pressure you're applying because we can't get the pressure high enough to cut off blood flow. So in the lower body, you're going to have to go with a little bit of a wider cuff meaning 10 centimeters, 12 centimeters wide. A 5 centimeter cuff, for most people, you're not going to be able to cut off flow, but you will be in the upper body. So I guess the characteristic would be, does the device that I'm purchasing, is it able to quantify the pressure that I'm applying? That would be the number one thing I'd be looking for.
Very cool.
So doing my homework, getting ready for the show, I saw that you had a little experience in bodybuilding yourself, Jeremy. And so let's talk about BFR and potential benefits for hypertrophy and muscle building and kind of how that would find its way into a program, kind of what the protocol would look like if I was going to integrate this into a traditional muscle building program.
Yeah. And I think this is, one of the areas where it's going to be pretty equal to high load exercise. So with bodybuilding, there is no performance aspect. It's just all about muscle growth. So when we look at the literature, muscle growth increases with blood flow restricted exercise, and it's almost always equivalent to that of high load exercise, no matter how you want to look at it. You want to look at the fiber level, you want to look at MRI, CT, ultrasound, it doesn't matter. The growth is almost always equivalent to that of traditional high load exercise. So with that in mind, that opens the door for bodybuilders, because you could almost, if you really wanted to, I don't know if anybody who does this, you could train exclusively with blood flow restricted exercise, because the response is going to be very similar to that of high load exercise. Now, that's not how I would use it. I would probably have, if I'm training twice a week, I would have it to where, maybe half of the week you're training traditionally. The other half of the week, maybe you're training with lower lows in combination with blood flow restriction. That's one way that you can use it. Another way that's often been utilized is, maybe people bodybuilders who still like to include heavy squats, deadlifts, things like that. Maybe you finish off that workout with maybe some knee extensions or leg curls with blood flow restriction. So a lot of people have utilized that, or same thing with upper body exercise following bench press. Now, one of the things I'd say with that is, the muscle can only respond so much within a given training session. So if you have absolutely obliterated your legs, and let's say you've done so many different exercises for your quadriceps, and then you say, hey, I want to finish off with doing leg extensions with blood flow restriction. That's fine. But at some point, you're probably not adding anything more to the anabolic response. You might just be delaying your recovery. So I think you'd have to keep in, how much work have I already done for this muscle group? The other way you could utilize it is, if, you've been training for a period of time, you might have some sort of injury where you can't train heavy, or you can't train how you want to train. So you could use blood flow restriction during that period of time to get you back to training how you prefer. So there's lots of different ways that you could utilize it. I think the big point would be to keep in mind, how much have I already trained this muscle group today? Because that's going to dictate how much more I can get out of it, if that makes sense. But I think that with muscle growth, you'd have no worries. You could use it so many different ways. Strength, if you're a powerlifter, that's going to be slightly different. You could still utilize it, but you'd have to be a little bit more careful.
So I have tons and tons of questions off of what you're going on here. So let's start with kind of working backwards. And in terms of how taxing it may be in factoring into recovery when you're looking at overall load or volume, to say, like, we know if we program more eccentrics, there's going to be a lot more soreness and recovery time required for that. So we might damper how much volume of that we put in. Where does BFR fit into that scheme of things in terms of how taxing it may be physiologically when I am trying to factor volume over a workout or over a period of a week?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that seems to be clear is that, clear is not a fair word. One of the things that's been seen repeatedly is when you do low load exercise with blood flow restriction, especially if you haven't done it before, you're going to be very sore, very sore. Now, the issue is that if you look at the fiber level, the fiber seems to be structurally intact. So it's not clear on what that soreness, what that DOMS is actually in response to. But I'd say I'm going to answer this differently today than I would 10 years ago. Because when I used to talk about it, I would say, it's clearly easier to train with low loads in combination with blood flow restriction than high load exercise. And the recovery is clearly better. I still think there's something to that, but I think a lot of that had to be dependent upon what you're comparing it to. When you're looking at high force eccentric actions, well, that might not be a fair comparison because most people aren't even doing that in the gym. That's stuff that's coming from the muscle damage literature, which is entirely different. But I would say that there's some reason to believe that you might be able to recover from blood flow restriction faster than high load exercise. I don't know if it's just the lack of load, but you're going to have to figure in the soreness and how much of that you can handle, because initially, and it will become less with repeated bouts. So it's the same thing with high load exercise, but initially you're going to be pretty sore. But there are studies that do blood flow restriction multiple times per day, multiple days per week. And I don't know that you could do that with high load exercise. So there is some evidence, there is some reason to believe that the recovery is a little bit better. That's probably the loading, but you will be sore. I think that should be clear, because some people might hear, oh, the recovery is better, and then I go off and do this, and then they're sore as hell. And then they're kind of like, wait a second, I thought this was going to be much, easier to recover from, if that makes any sense.
Total sense. And so now that's my next question is in terms of loading. One of the things that has changed quite a bit over time, since when I was in school, it was these pretty restricted parameters in terms of where hypertrophy happens. You had this under 6 and under was strength, and 8 to 12 was hypertrophy, and then anything above that was muscular endurance. And now we're starting to see where there's hypertrophy happening from 3 to 30. Andy Galpin has said. So what end of the continuum is this better served for? Is this better served for those higher rep sets, those higher and lighter loads?
Yeah, I think if you're going to use blood flow restriction, and I think that's a good point, that the benefits are observed with in combination with low load exercise or low intensity exercise. So anywhere between 20 and 30% of your 1RM. We've gone as low as 15%. I probably wouldn't recommend that, but I think 30% 1RM is probably going to, I don't know if that's a sweet spot, but we definitely see repeatable adaptations there. I think if you start getting into the high loads, so 60 and 70% of 1RM, if you add blood flow restriction on top of that, you're not getting anything extra. So I think if you're going to use it, then use it with low loads, because all you're going to get at high loads is the same response, but with more discomfort. So it makes no sense to me to apply blood flow restriction with high loads based on the data that I've seen so far.
How's that for a selling point for exercise, Mike? Same workout just makes you feel way worse. Hey, everybody, a quick break in the action here. Hope you're enjoying the show, and we appreciate you listening. We're working hard to bring you the highest quality content and best guests every single week. So if you could do us a big favor and go and like and subscribe to the show on whatever platform you get your podcasts on, it would be greatly appreciated. Be sure to listen at the end of the show also to find out where you can find out more information about our courses, as well as a special discount code for all our listeners. Thanks again, and let's get back to the show. All right. So my next question is, most of the stuff that I have seen has been congruent, and this is also some stuff I've seen with the higher rep, low load type work. Is it generally is slanted towards more like single joint, simple exercises, leg extensions, bicep curls, that sort of thing? Is there certain exercises and movement patterns that are more conducive to BFR, and other ones probably that aren't going to translate as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's because of how of the exercises that we utilize in research, and I think it also stems from the fact that that's where we're applying the restriction. So we're applying the restriction on top of the leg or top of the arm, and it's easier to do that with single joint movements. Now there are benefits observed or documented benefits to doing something like the bench press or the squat. That has been observed. It's not quite as much data. You'd obviously always want to see more of that, but you could utilize this for many different types of exercises. Now, what I would say, and there is data that, let's say you use the bench press. Obviously, you have the restriction here. So the only thing that's being restricted is the arm. But there is some data that suggests that it can actually increase muscle size of the chest as well, even though it's not directly under restriction. Now, how would that work? I don't have a clue. I think one of the ways that we typically think about is that if you fatigue the triceps, maybe the chest has to pick up the load. I don't know if that's true. That's something we say a lot, though. And that's one explanation. Now, if I was a normal, healthy individual who wanted to utilize this, if I was doing the bench press, I would probably superset it with an exercise that directly is underneath the cuff. So maybe you do the bench press with maybe tricep extensions, or shoulder press with tricep extensions, or some sort of back movement with a bicep curl or something like that. I think that would give you a pretty good workout. But you're right, most of the literature and most of the recommendations are for single joints, but it has been used successfully with more compound movements as well.
Now, last question on kind of protocols with this is, Mike's going to talk about recovery more in a holistic manner, but more recovery between sets. That sometimes is dictated by load. Obviously, the heavier you go, the more rest period we need, but also by the neurological implications that are there, that you need more time to recover from the neurological stress. So what kind of connection is there in terms of any kind of neurological connections that you found, as well as how that may impact rest periods in between here?
Yeah, I think as far as recovery between sets, it's very minimal. You're going to get some recovery, but I think that when you start looking at some of those metabolites that build up, during normal exercise, those are being flushed out. when you have a rest period of blood flow restriction, they are not being flushed out. They're being basically largely maintained there. So your recovery is heavily impacted in a negative way in the exercise session. And that's one of the benefits that we actually think behind how it occurs, because you're going to have to recruit more fibers for that next set to even execute the movement. So from a recovery standpoint, while blood flow restriction is on, it's very negative. It's going to negatively impact your ability to do exercise. And we have people who get to the fourth set of exercise where they might be able to do 2 repetitions with 30% of their 1 RM at the very beginning, at least. So I think recovery within the bout is you don't have much recovery. But I think that between exercise bouts, if it's just the fact that you're lifting with a lower load or lower overall stresses, which is why you're able to bounce back a little faster, I'm not sure. But the recovery in the exercise, yeah, it's not so good.
Okay, so I'm sorry, Mike. I'm going to keep hijacking this because I keep coming up with questions the more Jeremy gives us answers here. In that, what about levels of adaptation in terms of, we know that we need progressive overload if we're lifting weights or working against resistance. Is there an adaptation where we might need to increase the level of occlusion to get the same result, that people will have some level of adaptation to the restriction itself?
That's a good question. I think it depends upon what you're trying to do. There are studies that progress the pressure. In other words, maybe they start off with a low pressure and they incrementally increase it. And they use that as a method for trying to induce further adaptation. If it was me, I would say I would look at my repetitions. And then once I start getting out of this repetition range, I start doing more and more, I would increase the load. Because I think load is keeping it low, relatively speaking, but I think load is pretty important to progress. Now, as far as the pressure, if you repeatedly do this type of exercise, one of the things that might happen is you might have some cardiovascular changes that might lower your blood pressure. So it might be worth every once in a while, every couple of months or so, is if you don't have something that can detect the pressure every time, it might be worth checking it to see if maybe your arterial occlusion pressure has changed. So maybe you could alter the pressure that way. As far as adaptation, I think if you're interested in muscle growth, muscle strength, I think you can get away with a wide range of pressure. So 40% AOP, so 40% of the pressure it takes to completely cut off blood flow. We've shown that to be very similar to 80% and 90%. However, vascular adaptation, so changes in resting limb blood flow, things like that, that might require a higher pressure. Again, we need a lot more data to be able to say this confidently, but we do have some data that suggests that vascular adaptations are greater at 80% than they are at 40%. And if you want to see changes that are more similar to traditional exercise, you need that higher pressure. So I think if you're interested in the vascular side and the muscle side, maybe you need a little bit of a higher relative pressure. If all you're interested in is muscle, then you have quite the wiggle room.
So let's shift gears. Let's talk about the connection of using BFR for athletic performance, whether it be strength, power, endurance. What have you seen in terms of any data back on implications with that?
Yeah, there are a lot of sports teams that utilize blood flow restriction. When we look at the D1 athletics in the United States, it's at every major program. It's made its way into the NFL, MLB. I would say that Johnny Owens is a big reason for that. Not only him, but he is a big reason. He's done a lot of work on that side of things. We have Barcelona Football Club, Manchester United. All of these guys are implementing and utilizing blood flow restriction at Philadelphia Eagles. Now, how are they using it? Mostly from a rehabilitation perspective. And I think there's also some interest in the recovery. So following a workout, And that's something I'm interested in too. I don't know exactly what that means, to be honest, when they say we finished the workout and then we're going to use blood flow restriction as a way to improve that recovery to the next bout. I don't know how that would be working, if it is working, but that is something that has been a kind of a recent focus. Now, why are they using it for rehabilitation and not as much as a direct training method? And I think a lot of it has to do with many of them focus on high loads, high intensity. And they believe that that is the best way to approach things. And for certain sports, that might very well be the case. And many of them, let's talk about something like even cycling. Now, let's say you're a pro cyclist, and there's some data in certain populations that maybe cycling with blood flow restriction could be beneficial. I think from their perspective is how much is the cyclist going to get from coming in and cycling at a very slow speed, even if it is with blood flow restriction? Or they might say, I don't want my athlete training at that slow of speed. I don't want them to get any practice doing that. I don't want them to take away from their actual training. So I think that's why there's a focus on when something goes wrong, or maybe the recovery perspective. For me, I struggle with athletic performance and resistance training just in general. And I think that most people think I'm wrong about this, and that's perfectly fine with me. I struggle with just resistance training and athletic performance just in general, about how much of a direct effect does it actually have. And part of it's because what is athletic performance, and how do you even document that? It's so hard to know. I do think there could be something to their, maybe an indirect effect. In other words, there does appear to be something with resistance training and injury prevention. Again, I don't know how that possibly works, but I mean, there's some pretty good evidence, at least from what I can see, that people who lift weights, they seem to get hurt less. So from an athletic performance perspective, if you're in the game longer, then that's pretty good for performance if you can train more consistently. But I think blood flow restriction in that world, in high performance athletics, it probably is not going to be your sole focus as a training method. Now, there are certain athletes like Dwight Howard. I think he was on ESPN talking about the use of blood flow restriction. For him, when he got older into his career, it was harder for him to recover from his training bouts, and it was, potentially taking away from his performance on the court. So if he could do something that was a little bit of a lower stress, and then recover for his actual sport, I think that's how he was utilizing it. But long-winded answer, I think most for athletic performance are probably using it for a rehab, or trying to figure out how they might be able to implement this from a recovery perspective. Powerlifting, could you do that? Yes. You could use it as, maybe if you don't have that mental focus that day, maybe you can use lower lows with blood flow restriction. Or maybe you could have certain training cycles where you're including that. But if that's your sole form of training is with low loads, and your sport is about who can lift the heaviest, you're going to lose, and it's not going to be close. You have to have some sort of high loads if your sport is dictated by who can lift the heaviest, if that makes sense.
No, totally. Absolutely. I think one of the things that sort of a common theme throughout this conversation is, it's beneficial for certain things, but it's really not good for other things. And that's really what you're saying. It seems to be really good from a rehabilitation standpoint, and it seems to be good for accessory work from a hypertrophy standpoint. But what you're saying from from an athletic performance, from a strength and a power, it's probably not a good choice. And you started to kind of go down this road a little bit, but from a recovery standpoint, we've got all these modalities when it comes to recovery. We've got ice, we've got heat, we've got soft tissue, we've got, compression boots like Normatec, stuff like that. But it seems like what you're saying, that blood flow restriction from a general overall recovery standpoint is probably not a recommended modality.
So it would depend upon how you're using it. So some of these teams that are using it, they're not applying it with contraction, right? Because I think to your point, it's like, wait a second. So to recover from exercise, we're going to do more exercise. And I think how the teams are using it is there is some data that, from a rehabilitation perspective, if you just apply a cuff and you do cycles of inflation and deflation, so very similar to ischemic preconditioning, but the pressure is lower, there could be some benefit there. And I think that some of the sports teams are saying, I wonder if doing this post-training or post-exercise, I wonder if we can get some sort of recovery from that. And I don't know. I don't want to come on here and say that doesn't make sense, because my inability to think of how that might be working doesn't mean it doesn't do something. I am personally interested in that, about applying just BFR. Can that improve your ability to return to your sport or return to training or your recoverability? I just don't know exactly how that would work. Not saying it doesn't, but I mean, I'm interested in studying that more, certainly.
So a question that just came in my head is whether you're using it for performance or recovery is, have you seen anything in terms of any level of an interference effect that to say, okay, well, I don't want to do this X amount of hours or days prior to events where I'm going to need to be performing maximally, or I need to be able to create high load contractions?
No, I think the only thing I would think of with that is, if you haven't used it before or consistently, and then you're going to apply it a couple days before a meet, and then you go into the meet, like in this case powerlifting, or your event, and you're sore, well, that's not very good. So that would be the only thing I could think of. I will say that there is some interesting work being done in cycling. Not to say that it's been shown to be overly beneficial from a performance perspective, but I think you guys are probably aware that it's very difficult to actually quantify performance in a lab using time trials. There's lots of things that go into time trials, but one of the ways that people are trying to get around the idea of, I don't want my athletes training at a low speed, is they have their athletes do their high intensity training, but during the rest period they apply blood flow restriction, and they have seen some vascular changes to that, and some aerobic benefits to doing that. It just hasn't translated to time trial performance, and there might be 1,000 reasons for that, but that's one of the ways that people are trying to utilize it without having to use it with low loads or low intensities from a pure performance perspective.
Now, would it also be similar when we're looking at programming? We generally want to put our more higher neurologically, the exercise that require higher neurological demand earlier in our workouts. Would this be something that would fit better later in your programming? Like once you're done with your BFR, pretty much you should be done.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're someone who's interested in getting the most out of, let's say you're squatting or power cleaning or whatever. Yeah, I would start with that, because once you do blood flow restricted exercise, you're going to be smoked. And you're not going to want to do anything. If you try to squat afterwards, you'd be pretty shaky, I would imagine. So yeah, I think that's a good point. I would plan on that being almost the end of my workout.
And then going back to something you mentioned with doing it with some of the low level work, is it something that may have benefits if you're doing, say, a lower intensity, quote unquote, zone 2 type, zone 1 or zone 2 type of work? Could there be possibly some aerobic and cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory benefits to that?
Yeah, there is some data that does suggest that. I think that's going to be very population dependent. You can come up with some studies that show that athletes could walk at slow speeds. I mean, there is this data that does exist. They had trained basketball players walk with blood flow restriction and improve aerobic capacity. I just have a hard time believing that would be consistently observed. It would be hard. It's hard for me to believe that someone who's an athlete could walk at a slow speed, or cycle at a slow speed and improve aerobic capacity over what they currently have. Maybe I could be wrong. Maybe I'm just wrong, but that's just kind of my hunch. But I do think there's certain populations where maybe that could be beneficial in older adults. It has some aerobic capacity benefits there. People who can't do anything else, maybe it's a way for them to progress their exercise ability to get back to doing kind of what they like to do, or more traditional type exercise. So there is data with low intensity aerobic exercise that improves aerobic capacity. But if I had to put money down, I would say you're probably going to most likely see a benefit from an aerobic perspective in people who are of a deconditioned state, or older adults, something like that. I'm less inclined to believe that that's really going to benefit at low speeds, high performing athletes. Now, the cardiovascular changes in response to resistance exercise, as far as like resting blood flow and things like that, and indirect markers of capillarization, there is data that shows that happens in probably people who would be trained. I would believe that, but I don't know that would increase your overall, systemic aerobic ability.
All right, I'm going to sneak one more in, Mike, and then you can start to wrap things up. So in terms of programming, is this also something that you would benefit from kind of periodizing and having during certain phases, or is it could be something you just pretty much can consistently do throughout a training cycle or throughout the year? So in terms of mapping it out, is there certain blocks that this would be more conducive to, or it can fit anytime, anywhere?
I think it could fit pretty much anytime you would need it. It would just be, what is my goal? If your goal is to, in some sort of training cycle or phases, to be able to produce as much strength as possible, then it should not be your sole focus. I think that's clear. But I do think it could be used. I mean, you could program it in for a period of time, to keep things interesting. Maybe keep training fresh in your mind. You could also use it as needed. Maybe you have a certain plan for that day, but for whatever reason, life happens, your life stress, or some sort of nagging injury to where you're good enough to train, but not good enough to train heavy. Maybe that's a day you use it. So yeah, I think it's fair to say it could be used in lots of different ways, probably whatever the phase is. But don't forget about what your main goal is for that phase.
Absolutely. So, Perry, I've hijacked Dr. Loenneke for most of this hour. So, what final questions or thoughts do you maybe have?
No, it's just, a lot of the information. I love the fact that, when we ask the questions, and you mentioned this before, it's like, you're like, I'm not really sure. So, we appreciate your honesty with a lot of this stuff, because a lot of the time people just try to make stuff up. And I love the fact that you're just like, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and this is what sort of the data suggests and the trends that we're seeing. So, I think that's important for a lot of people to understand is, someone with your knowledge, you're still going, I don't know, but I'm hoping to learn that soon. So, we do appreciate that so much, because it's just refreshing to hear. But so tell us what you're working on now, and do you have anything coming up in the next year, or any projects that you're working on? What's on the horizon for you?
So I had two of my students, Rob Spitz and Vicky Wong. Both of them just finished up two dissertations. So we're looking through that data right now. That was on blood flow restriction, or it was exercise with and without blood flow restriction, low force contractions, high force contractions. I would say one of the things that, is an interesting result from that is related to the cross-education effect. So I won't give away too much, but we did find some very interesting results as it relates to blood flow restriction. Cross-education meaning if we have people train their right side, but not their left side, we were able to see some sort of benefit on that opposite arm, even though it didn't exercise with blood flow restrictions. So we're going to try and figure out what that might mean, or how that might be occurring. But that's pretty fascinating for us. There's another dissertation that's actually starting up. We're going to start data collection on it this Saturday, actually, looking at kind of the cross-education effect as well. That's kind of been of interest the past couple of years. It actually doesn't involve blood flow restriction at all, but kind of surrounding the cross-education effect with high-load exercise, things like that. The other study that we're going to start this semester is related to, we've done a little bit of work on this, on the effect of blood flow restriction on pain, or your ability to sense pain. For example, pressure pain threshold and things like that. So following blood flow restricted exercise, you're less sensitive to pain. And that might have some rehabilitation utility as well. If you might be able to use this, you raise your threshold for pain before you go to therapy, so maybe you can get more out of that exercise session. So that's of interest to us, but we're going to be looking at some differing kind of pain markers this coming semester. So I'm excited about that. And I think the utility for me, the thing that I look forward to is just working with my students, so past and present. It's the best part of being in academia. So it's cool to teach undergrad, it's cool to teach grad classes, but when you work with the students in your own lab, and you help develop them, and you guys are both developing ideas and bouncing ideas off of each other, it's awesome. Because if you get good students, they don't let you get away with anything. So they don't care who you are, they don't care how long you've been doing things, and to be fair, that's really what's needed, because you can start to run into the things of, well, I've done this for a long time. It's like, so what? What would happen if we did this? Or what would happen if this was wrong? Or what would happen if you did this? So, I have that every single day. And I have students who, every time you speak, there's always some sort of comeback. So that's important. I don't know if that happens in every lab, but it certainly happens in mine. And I think it's pretty good. So I've been lucky to work with really good students, but I'm looking forward to continuing that.
Well, I am a huge fan of the work you're doing. That's why I was totally stoked when you said you give us the time, and I'm hoping we can circle back and have you again, because the thing that's hitting me now is realizing that in the grand scheme, the footprint of things like BFR is so new. When you're talking about it's only been around 20, 25 years, which is a blip in the scientific community as far as what we can learn and benefit from things like this. So I'm sure if we have another conversation a year, we'll have all sorts of new stuff to kind of go back and revisit. So want to thank you again for your time, and want to thank everyone for listening. And this has been the Principles of Performance podcast. Thank you for listening to the Principles of Performance podcast. If you've enjoyed our content, please like and share on your social media outlets, as well as subscribe and give us a review on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your preferred platform is to listen to. For more information on the Principles of Program Design courses and workshops, visit us at www.principlesofprogramdesign.com and follow us on all of the social media channels where we post new content every day. To save 10% on any PPD courses, enter the discount code PRINCIPLESPODCAST10 at checkout. If you have any questions we can answer or suggestions for the show, you can email us at info@principlesofprogramdesign.com or message us on social media. Thank you again for your support.